Memphis, Tennessee. August 16th, 1977. A 21-year-old woman walks through the rooms of Graceland and finds the man she was supposed to marry dead on the bathroom floor. He was 42 years old. He had been the most famous entertainer on the planet. He had been married, divorced, and was engaged to be married again when it ended. What happened between the boy from Tupelo, who shook the world, and the final chapter that unfolded in that mansion? The love story, the betrayals, the years of quiet unraveling, is one of the most human stories in American music history. This is the tragic story of the Elvis Presley marriage. The boy before the king. To understand how Elvis Presley loved and how he lost, you have to start long before the fame, long before Graceland, long before any of it. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8th, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a two-room house his father Vernon had built by hand. The family had almost nothing. Vernon Presley worked odd jobs and struggled to keep the lights on, and there were stretches of genuine hardship. His mother, Gladys, was the anchor of the household, fiercely devoted to her son in the way that only a mother who had lost a twin child at birth could be. Elvis had a twin brother, Jesse Garon, who was stillborn. From the very beginning, Gladys poured everything into the boy who had survived. The bond between Elvis and his mother was unlike almost anything else in his life. She called him by nicknames, worried about him constantly, and treated him with a tenderness that never fully left him, even as he grew into a man and then into a phenomenon. People who knew them both described it as inseparable, the kind of closeness that goes bone deep. Gladys didn't just love her son. She was devoted to him in a way that shaped how he saw women, how he needed to be seen, for the rest of his life. The family moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948, settling into a housing project called Lauderdale Courts. Elvis was 13. He was quiet, polite, and largely invisible in the social landscape of his school. He dressed differently from the other kids. Brighter colors, pleated pants, his hair styled with care. He sang at church, played guitar at home, and carried himself with a sensitivity that could easily be mistaken for shyness. What nobody fully recognized in those years was what was already forming inside him musically. He was absorbing everything: the gospel music from church, the rhythm and blues coming out of the black neighborhoods of Memphis, the country sounds that had always been in the air. He was quietly building something that would eventually knock the entire country sideways. In 1954, 18 years old and working as a truck driver, Elvis walked into Sun Records and recorded a couple of songs as a birthday present for his mother. Sam Phillips, the man running Sun Records, wasn't immediately struck by what he heard, but he kept the young man's name on file. A year later, Elvis was called back in, and what happened in that studio during the summer of 1954 would change American music permanently. By 1956, Elvis Presley was not just famous. He was a force of nature. The television appearances, the hip movements, the voice that could go from a whisper to a roar inside a single phrase, all of it combined into something that had never existed before. Girls screamed and fainted at his concerts. Parents and moral authorities denounced him as dangerous. Radio stations played his records around the clock. He signed with RCA Records, moved to a larger stage, and within the span of a single year went from driving a truck in Memphis to appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show in front of tens of millions of people. But for all of that, for all the screaming crowds and the television cameras and the national conversation he was suddenly dominating, there was something that Elvis carried privately that the public largely didn't see. In August 1958, right in the middle of his army induction, He had been drafted and was preparing to ship out to Germany. His mother, Gladys, died. She was 46 years old. Heart failure. The loss broke something in Elvis that was never fully repaired. He was 23 years old, and the person he had been closest to in the world was gone. He was photographed weeping openly at her funeral, something that was unusual for men of that era to do publicly. He had her buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis. The grief was total and consuming, and the people around him said he was never quite the same afterward. He shipped out to Germany that same year, and it was there, still carrying that grief, that everything changed again. A 14-year-old girl in Germany. On September 13th, 1959, at a gathering at Elvis's rented home in Bad Nauheim, West Germany, a U.S. Air Force officer named Curry Grant introduced Elvis to the stepdaughter of another officer stationed at the base. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu. She was 14 years old. Elvis was 24. She had come to the gathering in a navy and white sailor dress, nervous and not entirely sure what to expect. When she walked in, Elvis noticed her immediately. He had her sit beside him, played the piano, and sang for her, including a performance of Are You Lonesome Tonight? She was stunned. This was the most famous person in the world, and he was sitting in a room playing songs specifically for her. What struck him about Priscilla was something he articulated to a friend that night. He saw a resemblance to his late mother, Gladys. She had dark hair and a similar delicate quality that reminded him of the woman he had just lost. He told a close friend that Priscilla was young enough that he could shape her into exactly what he wanted. It was a statement that said as much about Elvis as a man as anything he ever put on record. When Priscilla left that night, she assumed it was a one-time thing. She was a teenager. He was a global superstar. Surely that was the end of it. But Elvis called and invited her back. On their second visit, he led her upstairs to his private room, where he spoke about his grief over his mother and kissed her before she left. She later described it as her first real kiss. The visits continued. By the time Priscilla had seen him 4 times, her stepfather, Captain Paul Beaulieu, demanded a meeting. Elvis came to the house in his army uniform, accompanied by his father Vernon, and spoke respectfully to Priscilla's parents about his intentions. He was careful, measured, reassuring. He agreed to terms: curfews, transportation arrangements, supervised visits. Her parents, somewhat stunned by the man standing in their living room, agreed to allow the relationship to continue. There was a pattern established in those months in Germany that would define the next decade of both their lives. Elvis called the shots. He decided when they met, what she wore, how she presented herself. He preferred her with heavy eye makeup and her hair styled in a particular way. She was 14 years old and utterly in love with the most famous man in the world, and she adapted herself to whatever he wanted. She has spoken, years later, about the way she tried constantly to appear older than she was, putting on clothes and makeup to close the age gap that existed between them. Elvis left Germany in March 1960 and returned to America. The relationship continued by telephone and letter across an ocean. For the next 3 years, they communicated regularly, with Elvis calling regularly and Priscilla visiting the United States when her parents allowed it. She was living 2 lives simultaneously: the ordinary life of a teenager on an Air Force base in Europe, and the extraordinary, entirely hidden life of a young woman in a relationship with Elvis Presley. In 1963, after considerable persuasion from both Priscilla and Elvis, her parents agreed to let her move to Memphis to finish high school. The arrangement Elvis presented was that she would live with his father Vernon and stepmother Dee, attend the local Catholic girls' school, and the two would work toward marriage. Her parents accepted the terms. What actually happened was that within a relatively short time, Priscilla had moved into Graceland itself, living under the same roof as Elvis, years before they were married. She enrolled at Immaculate Conception High School in Memphis and graduated in May 1963. The years that followed, from 1963 to the wedding in 1967, were years in which Priscilla was at Graceland, in Elvis's world, surrounded by his circle of friends and employees, while he continued his film career in Hollywood. She was there when he was home. When he left for Los Angeles, she was expected to remain in Memphis and wait. What she was not expected to know about, but did because it was almost impossible to avoid, was the other women. Hollywood and the women Elvis didn't talk about. The early 1960s were Elvis's film years. Between 1960 and 1969, he made 31 movies. Most of them were light, formulaic productions designed to generate soundtracks and keep his name in circulation during a period when the cultural conversation was moving rapidly away from the style of music he had made famous. The Beatles arrived in 1964 and shifted the entire landscape. But through it all, Elvis kept filming, kept recording, and kept living a life in Hollywood that operated on entirely different rules from the one Priscilla was living at Graceland. In 1963, while filming Viva Las Vegas, Elvis met his co-star, Anne Margaret. She was 22, Swedish-born, an actress and singer with enormous charisma and a quality on stage that mirrored something in Elvis himself. The chemistry between them on screen was unmistakable, and the chemistry off-screen was equally real. What began as a professional relationship became, by the accounts of people close to Elvis, the most genuinely mutual romantic connection he had during those years. Unlike many of the women who entered his orbit, Anne Margaret was not someone who simply adapted to him. She had her own career, her own ambition, her own presence in a room that didn't depend on his. Some people who knew Elvis during that period believed she may have been the one woman he had met who was truly his equal in the way that mattered most to him. Not deferential, not easily managed. The relationship between Elvis and Anne Margaret was serious enough that it generated public speculation. Reports reached Priscilla in Memphis. She confronted Elvis, and he dismissed the stories as press invention, insisting the coverage was driven by publicity needs for the film rather than any real involvement. Priscilla accepted this, or chose to accept it. The two things are not always the same. What ended Elvis's involvement with Anne Margaret was a practical collision between two worlds that couldn't coexist. Anne Margaret, in a press interview, gave the impression that she and Elvis were headed toward marriage. Elvis was incensed. In his world, Priscilla was the woman he intended to marry, and the suggestion that another woman might take that place, made publicly, without his control over the narrative, was something he couldn't tolerate. He confronted Anne Margaret directly, asking her whether she was going to be the kind of woman who could accept that things like this might happen, or not. The relationship ended in 1964. She would later write about it as one of the most significant connections of her life, charged, unfinished, and difficult to categorize. Anne Margaret attended his funeral in 1977 with her husband. Whatever had happened between them, she felt the loss. Throughout those years, there were other women too. Co-stars, women who appeared in his orbit during films, women who were drawn into his world by the gravitational pull of his fame. Elvis operated within a culture that had been built entirely around him. His circle of male friends and employees, known informally as the Memphis Mafia, existed to facilitate his life in every direction, including keeping these involvements from becoming public knowledge. The structure of his life was designed so that he could have multiple realities simultaneously, each one sealed off from the others. Priscilla, living at Graceland, was not entirely sealed off from what was happening. She read the gossip columns. She saw the photographs. She heard things. But she was also deeply in love with a man who, when he was present, could make the rest of the world feel irrelevant. And she was young, and she believed him when he reassured her. And she had invested years of her life into a relationship that had shaped her identity entirely. Leaving was not a thought she entertained. What Elvis told the people closest to him about Priscilla was revealing. He valued what he described as her purity. He had a compartmentalized view of women that placed them in categories, and Priscilla was the one he kept apart from everything else. Their relationship, according to Priscilla's own account in her 1985 memoir, did not become fully physical until their wedding night in 1967. He held her in a separate category from the women he was involved with during his film years, and that separation, in his mind, made what he was doing acceptable. By 1966, after nearly 7 years of a relationship that had taken Priscilla from a teenage girl on a German Air Force base to a young woman living inside the most famous private home in America, Elvis proposed. On Christmas Eve of 1966, he presented her with a 3.5-carat diamond engagement ring purchased from a Memphis jeweler named Harry Levitch. She was 21. He was 31. What came next would be one of the most watched weddings of the decade. The wedding and the life that followed. Elvis and Priscilla were married on May 1st, 1967, at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. The ceremony was small. Only a handful of close family and friends were invited, and notably, most of the Memphis Mafia was excluded from the guest list. A decision that caused real hurt among men who had devoted years of their lives to Elvis. The brevity and intimacy of the ceremony was itself a kind of statement. Elvis controlled every detail, including who got to witness the beginning of his marriage. Priscilla wore a white organza gown with long lace sleeves and pearl detail, topped with a rhinestone tiara and a 3-foot tulle veil. She had gone shopping for it herself in disguise, wearing a blonde wig and using the code name Mrs. Hodge to avoid attention. Elvis wore a black tuxedo. Their first dance was to his own recording of Love Me Tender. The wedding cake was 6 tiers tall and reportedly cost over $3,000. Around 100 guests attended the reception that followed. It was, by all accounts, a genuinely happy day. They honeymooned briefly in Palm Springs, then returned to Memphis. 3 weeks at their private ranch near the Mississippi border. A second, larger reception was held at Graceland on May 29th for the people who hadn't been invited to Vegas. The early weeks of the marriage were described by those around them as a warm and private beginning, a settling into something that both of them had been building toward for nearly a decade. Within months, Priscilla discovered she was pregnant. Their daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, was born on February 1st, 1968, exactly 9 months after the wedding. The timing was precise enough to be noted by everyone who followed Elvis's life. Lisa Marie's birth was a genuine source of joy for Elvis. He was photographed holding her with an openness and warmth that was unmistakably real. He had grown up without siblings who survived, had lost his mother, and here was a child of his own, something new and entirely his. People who were at Graceland during those early months described him as a devoted and attentive father, someone who genuinely delighted in his daughter. But the marriage was already running into the tensions that would eventually break it. Elvis's career during the late 1960s was going through a significant transition. The run of largely forgettable films was winding down. In 1968, he returned to live performance with a televised concert special, later known as the '68 Comeback Special, that reminded the world exactly what he was capable of. He appeared in all black leather, leaner and more focused than he had been in years, and delivered performances that were electric. It was one of the most dramatic professional rebirths in entertainment history. With the renewed career momentum came the return to touring, to Las Vegas residencies, to the life that had existed before the marriage, the constant travel, the entourage, the long stretches of time away from Graceland. Priscilla was expected to remain at home with Lisa Marie. The pattern from the years before the wedding reasserted itself, but now with a child involved and a marriage certificate on the wall. The affairs continued. Elvis had not changed his fundamental behavior. The touring life brought women. Las Vegas brought women. The entourage maintained its function. Priscilla, now a married woman and a mother, was living a version of the same life she had lived as an unmarried woman at Graceland, waiting, managing the household, raising her daughter, and watching her husband's public life from a distance. Something had also shifted in how Elvis saw Priscilla after the birth of Lisa Marie. The compartmentalization that had always defined how he saw the women in his life now applied to his own wife. People who knew him well said that after Priscilla became a mother, he seemed to place her in a different category, a category he didn't know how to inhabit romantically. The intimacy in their marriage changed. Priscilla wrote about this in her memoir with considerable candor. For several years, she endured it. She raised their daughter, kept the household running, and maintained the public image of a settled, content marriage. But she was growing into a woman who wanted something that Graceland, for all its grandeur, wasn't providing. She wanted autonomy. She wanted a life that was genuinely her own, not just an extension of his. She began taking dance lessons in the early 1970s. Through those lessons, she developed feelings for her instructor, a man she referred to in her memoir only by the name Mark. It was her first real acknowledgement that she was capable of wanting something outside of what Elvis had given her. The relationship remained relatively brief, but it was a turning point internally for Priscilla, a signal to herself that the life she had built entirely inside his world was no longer enough. By early 1972, it was over. She and Elvis separated in February of that year. The separation, the divorce, and what remained. The separation was announced quietly and without the kind of dramatic public confrontation that tabloids might have hoped for. Elvis and Priscilla had spent 14 years together, more than a third of his entire life up to that point. And whatever damage had accumulated in those years, there was also genuine history and genuine affection beneath it. After separating from Elvis, Priscilla began a relationship with karate instructor Mike Stone, a man whose path had actually crossed Elvis's world, since Elvis was a dedicated student of karate and Stone had been his teacher. The irony was not lost on anyone close to the situation. Elvis was reportedly furious when he learned the details of Priscilla's involvement with Stone, furious in the particular way of a man who had spent years justifying his own behavior while expecting fidelity from his wife. The people around him said his reaction to losing Priscilla was more intense than anyone had anticipated. The divorce was finalized on October 9th, 1973, in Santa Monica, California. What the public saw that day was not what they had expected. Elvis and Priscilla walked out of the courthouse together, holding hands, smiling. They embraced in the parking lot. The photographers captured images of two people who appeared, in spite of everything, to still care deeply about each other. It was a genuine moment, the formal ending of a marriage between two people who had grown up together, in some sense, and who would remain linked by their daughter and by the weight of everything they had shared. The settlement was fair. Priscilla received $725,000 in cash, child and spousal support, 5% of Elvis's new publishing companies, and half the proceeds from the sale of their Beverly Hills home. She had initially been offered less, but after consulting new lawyers, she revised the terms to reflect what Elvis could actually afford. He didn't fight it. They remained on good terms after the divorce. They co-parented Lisa Marie. They called each other. They attended events together for their daughter. The relationship that had survived Germany and Hollywood and years of distance and infidelity had evolved into something quieter and more sustainable, a genuine friendship built on the foundation of everything they had been through. But Elvis, now in his late 30s, was entering the most difficult period of his life. The years after, Linda Thompson and the long unraveling. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Elvis met Linda Thompson. It was the end of 1972. He had met her while the separation was underway, at a private movie screening at the Memphian Theater in Memphis, his preferred way of spending late nights. Thompson was 22 years old, recently crowned Miss Tennessee Universe, born and raised in Memphis. She was direct, funny, and entirely unintimidated by him. When Elvis began flirting with her that night, she pushed back. She had believed he was still married to Priscilla, and she was wary. When he told her the marriage was over, she famously challenged him, telling him he should have married a Southern girl in the first place. He laughed, agreed, and told her she was absolutely right. That moment, Thompson later wrote, was the beginning of everything between them. She moved into Graceland. For 4 years, from 1972 to 1976, Linda Thompson was the person closest to Elvis Presley in the world. She was his companion, his confidant, his constant presence. She has described their relationship as genuine and deep, built on shared humor, shared faith, shared Southern roots. They talked about getting married. For a time, it seemed like the life that hadn't quite worked with Priscilla might work with her. But Elvis, during those years, was also a man in serious decline, and Linda Thompson was increasingly the person managing that decline. His dependence on prescription medication had been building for years. Doctors, particularly a Memphis physician who had been providing him with prescriptions for an extended period, had enabled a level of drug use that was genuinely dangerous. Elvis was taking sleeping pills, stimulants, painkillers, and a range of other medications that were altering his behavior, his weight, and his physical health in visible and troubling ways. Thompson found herself in the role of caregiver more than girlfriend. She watched him, kept track of his medications, called his doctor when things became alarming, tried to intervene when his behavior was erratic. There were nights when she sat up monitoring his breathing. There were mornings when she wasn't certain what state he would be in when he woke. The people around Elvis, the doctors, the members of his inner circle, were not always willing or able to force a confrontation about what was happening to his health. And so the weight of managing it fell largely on the woman sleeping beside him. It was an enormous burden for a woman in her 20s to carry, and she has been honest in interviews about the toll it took on her. She loved him. She also couldn't sustain what the relationship was asking of her indefinitely. By 1976, after nearly 5 years at Graceland, Linda Thompson left. She has explained, in the years since, that she was emotionally exhausted and frightened for his safety in a way that she couldn't fix. She was not abandoning him. She was trying to save herself. But leaving meant that Elvis now needed someone else. He met Ginger Alden in late 1976. Her older sister was Miss Tennessee and had been invited to Graceland, and Elvis was immediately drawn to the younger sister, 20-year-old Ginger. She was beautiful, quiet, and in the initial phase of things, completely overwhelmed by the world she had entered. Elvis proposed to Ginger in January 1977. According to her account, He had his jeweler take the diamond from his famous TCB ring, the ring he wore that represented his personal motto, taking care of business, and reset it as an engagement ring for her. It was a significant gesture from a man who wore that ring as an emblem of his identity. They talked about a December wedding. Elvis told people he planned to give her the wedding of the century. But by the summer of 1977, Elvis Presley was in serious physical trouble. The touring schedule had continued, driven in part by financial pressures and in part by Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, who kept booking engagements regardless of Elvis's condition. People who attended his concerts in 1977 have described performances where he was barely able to get through the songs, slurring his speech, losing his place in the music, moving with difficulty. His weight had increased significantly from the athletic young man of his early career. His face was puffy. His eyes were glazed. Audiences sat in stunned silence watching someone they loved visibly struggling. His last concert was on June 26, 1977, at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis, Indiana. He managed to get through it. Nobody who was there that night fully understood it would be the last time. August 16th, 1977. The last weeks of Elvis Presley's life were spent largely at Graceland. He had a tour scheduled to begin on August 17th, a flight to Portland, Maine, to open a run of shows. There were people in his circle who quietly wished he would cancel it. His health had made the preceding months of touring difficult. Some nights on the road had been genuinely troubling for anyone who watched him perform. But the tour was booked, and the machinery around Elvis Presley kept moving. The night before, in the very early hours of August 16th, he returned to Graceland from a late-night visit to the dentist. He spent the early morning hours dealing with last-minute tour preparations, talking with members of his household, and eventually retired to his master suite sometime around 7 in the morning to rest before the evening flight. His 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, was at Graceland that week. He had spent time with her in those final days, riding golf carts around the property, watching movies, being her father. Ginger Alden was asleep in the bedroom. At some point in the late morning, she woke and realized Elvis wasn't beside her. She looked for him and found him on the floor of his bathroom, unresponsive. He was face down on the carpet, having collapsed. She called for help immediately. An ambulance took him to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The medical team worked to revive him. It was not possible. Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead at 3:30 in the afternoon on August 16th, 1977. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death listed cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat leading to heart failure. A subsequent medical review revealed that the extent of his prescription drug use had been a significant factor in his physical deterioration. He also had a number of other health complications that had gone unaddressed for years. The combination had simply become too much for his body. The news reached the world within hours. The reaction was unlike anything that had happened to American popular culture since the death of Franklin Roosevelt. A collective, simultaneous shock felt across generations and geographies. Fans gathered outside Graceland by the thousands. Priscilla was notified and came to Memphis. She has spoken about the moment she heard as something she couldn't make real in her mind. Lisa Marie, 9 years old, would grow up without her father. Elvis was buried initially at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, the same cemetery where his mother Gladys had been buried. In October 1977, both his and his mother's remains were moved to the meditation garden at Graceland, where they rest today. The funeral drew 50,000 mourners to the streets outside Graceland. James Brown, who had known Elvis since 1966, was among those who came to pay their respects. He sat alone with Elvis for a long time. Caroline Kennedy sent flowers. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement calling Elvis a symbol of the vitality and the good humor and the creativity of American life. He was 42 years old, and he had been famous since he was 21. What was left behind? In the years following Elvis's death, the story of his marriage and his personal life became as examined and discussed as any aspect of his artistic legacy. Priscilla Presley threw herself into the task of preserving and building the Elvis legacy. She co-founded Elvis Presley Enterprises and was instrumental in the decision to open Graceland to the public as a museum in 1982. What had been a private home, the place where she had lived as a young woman, where she had raised her daughter, where she had built and lost her marriage, became one of the most visited historic sites in the United States, second only to the White House in terms of annual visitors by some accounts. She protected his name, managed his image, and fought to ensure that what he had created survived him. It was not a small thing, and it required her to spend decades in service to a legacy that was also, in ways that were complicated, her own. In 1985, she published her memoir, Elvis and Me, which became an immediate bestseller. It was the most detailed account that had ever been published about what their relationship had actually looked like from the inside. The Germany years, the Graceland years, the marriage, the affairs he denied, the way the relationship had shaped her entire sense of herself. She wrote about it with honesty and without apparent bitterness, which said something about the woman she had grown into. She never remarried. When asked why, she said simply that she never wanted to marry again after him. Linda Thompson built a successful life after Elvis. She went on to work as a songwriter and television personality, married twice, first to Olympic athlete Bruce Jenner, then to music producer David Foster, and raised 2 sons. She has continued to speak openly and warmly about her years with Elvis, describing him as someone she genuinely loved, while also being frank about the difficulties of those final years and what watching his decline had cost her emotionally. Ginger Alden, the youngest and last woman in Elvis's life, published her own memoir decades later, describing the romance from her perspective. The whirlwind of entering his world, the proposal, and the devastating morning she found him gone. She has said she was supposed to tell him not to fall asleep. Those were the last words she remembers speaking to him. Lisa Marie Presley spent her life under the extraordinary weight of being her father's daughter. She was devoted to his memory, fiercely protective of his legacy, and candid about the complexity of growing up without him. She died in January 2023, at the age of 54, following a cardiac arrest. She was buried at Graceland in the meditation garden beside her father. It was, in its way, the closing of a circle that had opened in 1968 when she was born 9 months to the day after her parents' wedding. In 2023, it was also agreed that Priscilla Presley would eventually be buried close to Elvis in that same garden, not directly beside him, but nearby. The woman he had shaped, who had shaped herself back out of what he had made of her, who had spent decades building the world around his memory, she would be close to him in the end. The full picture. The story of Elvis Presley's marriage is one that doesn't resolve neatly because the man at its center was never a neat person. He was capable of extraordinary warmth and genuine love. The people who knew him best, Priscilla, Linda Thompson, the members of his inner circle, have all described a man who could be tender and funny and deeply present when he chose to be. He was a devoted father to Lisa Marie in the time he had with her. He was generous to an almost reckless degree with money and gifts. He had a spiritual side that he took seriously, reading widely in religious texts, and thinking genuinely about questions of meaning and mortality. He was also a man who had been handed total control of the world around him when he was very young, who had never been told no by anyone in his professional circle, and who had lost the most important person in his life, his mother, before he had fully formed as an adult. The pattern that followed, the need to control the women he loved, the compartmentalization, the inability to reconcile the different versions of himself. Those things didn't appear from nowhere. They were the product of a particular life, lived under particular pressures, without the anchors that might have given him different tools. He was never offered a genuine intervention. The people paid to serve him kept serving him, right up to the end. Priscilla Beaulieu was 14 years old when she sat down in a room in Bad Nauheim and heard the most famous man in the world play piano for her. She was 27 when she walked out of that life and began building her own. What she built turned out to be remarkable, not because of him, but because of her. And Elvis, who had everything the world could offer, who had sold over 1 billion records, who had made grown women weep simply by walking onto a stage, died alone on a bathroom floor in the house where he had been most himself at 42 years old, before a December wedding that never came. The mansion still stands on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Memphis. 100,000 people visit it every year. And in the garden behind the house, where the roses grow and the fountain runs, the family rests together. The mother he never recovered from losing, the daughter he loved with everything he had, and the man himself, the king. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Nashville, Tennessee, November 1962. One of the most famous singers in the world is standing in a concert crowd, not performing, just watching, when she notices someone across the room. 6 months later, she is standing at an altar. Her manager is furious. Her family didn't show up. And the story that follows is one that nobody around her saw coming. This is the dramatic story of Brenda Lee's marriage. Born into survival. To understand why Brenda Lee's marriage shook the world around her, you first have to understand the world she came from, because nothing about her life, from the very beginning, was ordinary. She was born Brenda Mae Tarpley on December 11th, 1944, in Atlanta, Georgia. She weighed only 4 pounds and 11 ounces, delivered in the charity ward of Grady Memorial Hospital. The doctors weren't certain she would survive the first days of her life. She did. Her parents, Reuben Lindsay Tarpley and Annie Grace Tarpley, were working-class people doing everything they could to stay afloat. Her father was a carpenter. Her mother worked grueling hours, sometimes 12 to 14 hours a day, at a cotton mill. The family didn't own a car. There were stretches where they couldn't afford basic medical care or enough food. At Christmas time, fruit was a luxury. This was the steady, grinding reality of poverty. What Brenda did have, from an almost impossibly young age, was a voice. Too large, too powerful, too complete to be coming from a child her size. She was singing publicly by the time she was 4. At 5 or 6, she won first prize at a local talent festival, singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," with a confidence that left people blinking. She could hold a melody after hearing it only twice, but everything that her voice promised was suddenly threatened when Brenda was just 8 years old. Her father, Reuben, died in a construction accident, falling from a scaffold while working. Her mother was now alone with 4 children and no safety net. For a time, the family bounced between relatives, staying wherever there was a spare room and a willing family member to take them in. It was around this time that Brenda's mother, Grace, recognized that her daughter's singing wasn't just a talent, it was a lifeline. She began actively seeking out opportunities for Brenda to perform. A local disc jockey named Peanuts Fairclough, who saw Brenda perform early on, was the person who suggested shortening her name from Brenda May Tarpley to simply Brenda Lee, saying it would be easier to remember. It was a small change, but it stuck. Grace later remarried a man named Jay Rainwater, who opened a record shop where Brenda would sometimes sing on weekends. It gave her a stage, even a modest one, and kept her performing while the family found its footing again. The real turning point came in 1955, when Brenda was 10 years old. She had the chance to audition for country music star Red Foley, and she made an impression so immediate and undeniable that Foley invited her to appear on his nationally televised show, Ozark Jubilee. When she stepped up and performed the song Dynamite, a number full of fire and attitude, the audience response was overwhelming. She was small, barely past the height of a kitchen counter, but the voice that came out of her was enormous. From that performance, she earned the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career: Little Miss Dynamite. From there, things moved fast. She began making appearances on some of the most watched television programs in the country. Shows hosted by Steve Allen, Red Skelton, and Ed Sullivan. By 1956, record companies were competing for her signature. She signed with Decca Records and was placed under the guidance of a legendary producer named Owen Bradley, who ran a studio operation in Nashville that would go on to shape the sound of country music for a generation. Dub Albritton, the man who had been managing Red Foley, stepped into the role of Brenda's manager, and he would become one of the most significant figures in her professional life, and in many ways, one of the most significant figures in her personal life too. Albritton was forceful, opinionated, relentlessly ambitious, and deeply strategic. He had come up through the carnival circuit. He and Colonel Tom Parker, who would later manage Elvis Presley, were old friends from those days. And he knew how to create excitement, build mystique, and push an act into markets that other managers hadn't considered. He was also protective of Brenda in ways that went beyond the professional, and he gave her some of the structure and security that the loss of her father had taken away. She has spoken about him as a kind of father figure, strict in some ways, but genuinely caring. One of Albritton's decisions that had a lasting impact was pushing Brenda's career into international markets before she had achieved total saturation in the United States. He pursued Europe and South America aggressively, and it worked. By the time Brenda was 15, she was a major star in England and France. A tour she did in France drew comparisons in the French press to Judy Garland, not a small thing for a teenage girl from Georgia. There was an odd wrinkle in the international fame. Because Brenda's voice was so powerful and mature-sounding, the foreign press had a hard time believing she was actually a child. A rumor circulated in France that she was, in fact, a fully grown adult, a midget, some outlets suggested. Her team had to produce photographs and documentation to prove otherwise. Back home, the hits were arriving regularly. Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, which she had recorded at 12 years old in 1958, would take 2 years to gain real traction, but when it did, it never truly left. Sweet Nothings went to #1 on the rock and roll charts in 1959. I'm Sorry topped the pop charts in 1960, followed by I Want to Be Wanted, which did the same thing. By the time Brenda was 16, she had scored multiple #1 records in multiple countries and was one of the most recognizable voices in the world. But the money she was earning was another matter entirely. Under the Jackie Coogan law, a legal provision put in place after the famous child actor Jackie Coogan was left with nothing after his earnings were spent by his parents, the bulk of Brenda's income was held in trust until she turned 21. She was performing at a global level, carrying the weight of her family's financial survival, and yet the earnings were largely untouchable for years. Meanwhile, in 1959, her stepfather deserted the family, leaving her mother and siblings with almost nothing to live on. For a while, despite everything Brenda was accomplishing on stage, her mother and siblings were living in a trailer park on $75 a month. She was touring the world and singing to thousands every night, and the people she loved most were struggling to make ends meet at home. By 1962, Brenda Lee was one of the biggest pop stars on the planet. She had toured with artists like Patsy Cline, George Jones, and Mel Tillis. She had performed at the Grand Ole Opry, played Las Vegas, traveled throughout Europe and South America. She had spent more of her childhood in dressing rooms, tour buses, and recording studios than in school classrooms, and she was 18 years old. She had never really had the chance to just be a girl. And then, on a November night in 1962, she walked into the Fairgrounds Coliseum in Nashville to watch a concert, not perform one. And that was about to change everything. The night at the fairgrounds. It was a Bo Diddley and Jackie Wilson concert at the Nashville Fairgrounds Coliseum in November of 1962. Brenda had gone to the show that night with her friend Rita Coolidge, who would go on to have her own successful recording career. And it was a rare evening off, a chance to be in the audience rather than on the stage. At some point during the evening, Brenda looked across the crowd and noticed someone, a young man. She has described, in interviews over the years, the immediate impact of that first glance. Someone she instantly felt she had to meet. His name was Charles Ronald Shacklett, though everyone called him Ronnie. He was tall, 6'4", which created quite a contrast with Brenda's 4'9". And he was from Nashville. His father, Earl C. Shacklett, was a prominent figure in the city's local government and would later become one of the founding members of the Metropolitan Council. Brenda didn't simply walk over and introduce herself. Instead, she did something that says a lot about who she was at 18. She wrote him a note. She explained in the note that she was about to leave for a 3-month tour of England and would be abroad for quite a while. She included her phone number and told him to call her when she got back. She handed him the note and left for England. For those 3 months, she didn't hear from him. Not a call, not a letter. She travelled through England, performed, and came home. But when she returned to Nashville, the two connected, set up a date, and began spending time together. What followed was described by those around her as a quiet courtship, one that Brenda kept largely to herself. She didn't announce the relationship publicly. She didn't tell her family right away. There was a period of several months where she knew what was happening between her and Ronnie, and the people around her simply didn't. She had always had so many eyes on her, so many people weighing in on her choices, that having something entirely her own must have felt like a rare and precious thing. By early 1963, it was clear to both of them where things were headed. They were going to get married, and that was the moment when the private became unavoidably public, because there were people in Brenda Lee's life who had very strong opinions about what she should and shouldn't do, and marriage to a young man she had known for less than 6 months was very much on the list of things they did not want her to do. The tension was building on more than one front, and what happened next would catch nearly everyone off guard. A wedding nobody saw coming. The disapproval came from 2 directions at once, and both of them hit hard. Dub Albritton, Brenda's manager, the man who had guided her career, helped build her into an international star, and served as one of the closest things to a father figure she had known since losing her own father, was strongly against the marriage. His reasoning was rooted in the music industry logic of the era. Female stars, especially young ones at the height of their commercial appeal, were expected to remain unattached. The thinking went that a married pop star lost a certain quality of fantasy for her audience, that fans, especially young male fans, wanted to believe in a possibility that marriage eliminated. It sounds calculated and cold by today's standards, but in the early 1960s, it was a genuinely dominant belief among music industry managers and label executives. All Britain had larger plans for Brenda. He had already arranged for her to appear at the Copacabana in New York on May 2nd, 1963, one of the most prestigious and high-profile venues in the country. The plan, as far as the management side was concerned, was that if the wedding was going to happen at all, it should happen after that appearance, once the professional moment had passed. There was talk of waiting, of timing, of what was best for the career. Brenda's family was also not on board. Her mother and siblings had depended on Brenda's earnings and presence for years. The idea of her making a major life decision this quickly, this young, with someone they didn't know well, it was too much, too fast. Whether the objection was emotional or practical, or some combination of both, the result was the same. No one from Brenda's family planned to attend any wedding. But Brenda and Ronnie didn't wait. On April 24th, 1963, without announcement or fanfare, Brenda Lee and Ronnie Shacklet were married at the Radnor Church of Christ in Nashville. They did not wait until after the Copacabana appearance. They did not arrange a grand ceremony. Brenda wore a white two-piece suit. The witnesses were members of Ronnie's family. Not a single person from Brenda's own family was present in that church. Think about what that image looks like for a moment. One of the most famous singers in the world, at 18 years old, standing in a church in Nashville, getting married, and the pews on her side of the aisle are empty. No mother, no siblings, just Ronnie, his family, and the quiet of a Sunday morning in a neighborhood church. The next day, the story broke in the Nashville press. A journalist named Gerald Henry wrote the story for the Tennessean, and it ran on April 25th, 1963, describing the quiet, unannounced ceremony. The headline alone was enough to spread the news through Nashville's music community like a brushfire. The world's most famous teenage pop star had eloped. Nobody had known it was coming. Almost nobody had been invited. When it was over, the newlyweds didn't linger in the city. They left for Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for their honeymoon, a small mountain resort town tucked into the Smoky Mountains, quiet and removed from the noise of Nashville and the press. They simply went, together. There is something quietly defiant about the whole picture. For a decade, Brenda Lee had been managed, guided, scheduled, monitored, and shaped by the people around her. Her voice had been the family's salvation, her manager's project, the music industry's product. For once, she had done something entirely on her own terms, and no amount of professional calculation or family pressure had stopped her. The career concerns, the timing, the Copacabana appearance, she had looked at all of it and chosen Ronnie Shacklet. What no one fully anticipated at the time was what that choice was actually going to mean for her, both in the years immediately ahead and for the rest of her life. The world they were stepping into. The first years of a marriage are rarely uncomplicated, and for Brenda and Ronnie, the complications were built into the very fabric of their daily reality in ways that most young couples don't encounter. Brenda was still one of the biggest stars in pop music. She continued recording and performing after the wedding. The music didn't stop. The touring didn't stop. The demands of the industry didn't slow down simply because she had gotten married. In 1963, the same year she got married, the single Losing You was released and charted well. In 1964, Is It True followed. The career was still very much alive and in motion, but the world of popular music was shifting in a way that nobody in the American music industry had fully prepared for. In February 1964, less than a year after Brenda and Ronnie's wedding, the Beatles arrived in the United States. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show drew an audience of 73 million people. Almost overnight, the musical landscape transformed. The British invasion reshaped what radio programmers wanted, what record labels were signing, and what young audiences were responding to. Artists who had dominated the charts just a year or two before found themselves being pushed aside by the new wave of British bands. Brenda was among those affected. The hits became less frequent. The commercial momentum that had felt so natural and steady throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s began to slow. For a young woman who had known no other life but performing and recording, who had been told from childhood that she needed to keep working or there might not be another gig, this was deeply unsettling. And then, in the mid-1960s, came a loss that hit her differently. Dub Albritton had been dealing with significant health problems for several years before his death in 1970. Near the end, he called Brenda to his apartment, knowing his time was short, and that visit stayed with her for decades. She has acknowledged that this period brought on a real depression, a sense of not knowing where she fit anymore in an industry that had changed drastically around her. It's worth pausing here to recognize what Ronnie Shacklett's presence meant during this period. He was the constant. While the music industry shifted, and the people who had defined the structure of her professional life came and went, Ronnie was there. He didn't come from the music world. He understood it well enough to navigate it on her behalf, but he wasn't of it. And that distinction mattered. In the early years of their marriage, Ronnie became actively involved in protecting Brenda's financial interests. The music industry in the 1960s was full of situations where artists, especially artists who had been working since childhood, with complicated contractual histories and multiple layers of management, were vulnerable to exploitation. People who had seen her earning capacity since she was a child sometimes treated her financial arrangements as opportunities. Ronnie was someone who looked at those situations clearly and pushed back on them. His involvement helped ensure that the wealth Brenda had spent her entire childhood generating actually remained in her control. It's also worth noting who Ronnie Shacklett was outside of his connection to Brenda's career. He was a private man by nature, something that stood in sharp contrast to the world his wife inhabited. He built his own business renovating fire-damaged homes, ran it for years, then eventually handed things over to his brothers. He never sought the spotlight, never chased celebrity, and kept a low profile throughout decades in which his wife was one of the most recognized voices in the world. He simply chose, quietly and consistently, to show up for his family. In the years following the wedding, Brenda and Ronnie started their family. They had 2 daughters. Their first daughter, Jolie, arrived, and then came Julie. Julie's birth was one of the most frightening moments the family would face together. She was born with a condition called hyaline membrane disease, a serious lung condition affecting newborns that makes breathing extremely difficult, and which was, at the time, frequently fatal in infants. The prognosis was deeply uncertain. The doctors who worked to save Julie's life included a physician named Dr. Mildred Stallman, a pioneer in neonatal care who had also attended to the births of the Kennedy children. Julie survived, but the ordeal was an intense and terrifying one. As a couple, they had walked into that experience together and come out the other side. Julie's name carried its own quiet significance. Brenda named her after the daughter of Patsy Cline, a tribute to her fellow country artist who had died in a plane crash in 1963, The same year, Brenda and Ronnie got married. It was a small, personal gesture, but it speaks to the kind of woman Brenda was. Someone who remembered, who honored people, who carried the people she loved with her in the details of her life. The challenges of the late 1960s and early 1970s were real and ongoing, but they were being faced by two people who had chosen each other, held on to that choice, and were building something together that didn't depend on chart positions or industry trends to stay standing. And then the health scare arrived, when the body sends a warning. By the early 1970s, the toll of a lifetime on the road had become impossible to ignore. Years of touring, constant travel, irregular schedules, the physical demands of live performance night after night, it had added up. In 1974, the warning arrived in the most serious form possible. She was rushed to the hospital with life-threatening blood clots. The condition required emergency surgery, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The surgery was performed, and it saved her life. The experience had a clarifying effect. The years of feeling pushed and pulled by industry pressures, the years of performing out of obligation and anxiety as much as out of love, the accumulated fatigue of a childhood that had never really had the luxury of just being a childhood, all of it pressed in around that medical crisis in a way that couldn't be ignored. What came next, though, was something close to a resurrection. Later that same year, Brenda returned to recording. She went back to her country music roots, the sound that had been in her blood before the pop charts and the international tours. She recorded Nobody Wins, written by Chris Christopherson, and the song climbed into the top 10 on the country charts. It was a genuine comeback, driven by conviction rather than commercial calculation. The string of country hits that followed in the mid and late 1970s confirmed that she hadn't simply survived. She had found her way back to something essential. Songs like Big Four Poster Bed, Wrong Ideas, and Sunday Sunrise all performed well on the country charts. A new generation of country music fans discovered her voice. She was no longer just a relic of the early 1960s pop era. She was an active, relevant presence in a different musical world. Throughout this entire period, the health scare, the surgery, the recovery, the return, Ronnie was there. He had been there through the lean years following the British invasion. He had been there when Julie was born, fighting for her life. He had been there when the career felt adrift after the loss of all Britain. He had been there through every professional shift and personal loss the previous decade had brought. And he was there now, in the hospital and in the long recovery that followed, consistent in the way he had always been consistent. The career that followed the mid-1970s comeback continued steadily. In 1989, Brenda appeared on a K.D. Lang album called Shadowland, which earned a Grammy nomination. She continued performing into the 1990s and beyond, accumulating honors and recognitions along the way. Induction ceremonies, Hall of Fame acknowledgements, and a legacy that became clearer and more celebrated with each passing decade. But time kept moving, and the people she had built her life around were not immune to it. Losing the pillars. The story of Brenda Lee's marriage is partly a story about what endures and partly a story about loss. In 1998, Owen Bradley died. Bradley had been the other great constant in Brenda's professional life. He was the producer who had guided her recordings at Decca, the man who sat behind the glass in the studio and helped translate what she was capable of into something the world could hear. He had been her creative collaborator and her mentor, and over the decades their relationship had grown into something that went far beyond the professional. He was, alongside Dub All-Britain, one of the father figures she had leaned on since childhood. She spoke about his death with a grief that was unmistakably deep. She mustered herself to sing There Will Be Peace in the Valley at his funeral, standing up and performing for someone she was devastated to have lost. It was one of the most personally difficult performances of her life. The following year, 1999, brought another kind of threat. This one directed at the voice that had carried her through everything. She was diagnosed with cysts on her vocal cords. The treatment options presented a difficult choice. Surgery could remove the cysts, but there was a meaningful risk that it could also cause permanent damage to her voice. For someone whose voice had been her entire life, her family's survival, her career, her identity, the prospect of that risk was not a small thing to weigh. She chose to take time off instead of proceeding with surgery. She rested, let her body settle, and waited to see what would happen. The cysts did not disappear entirely, but the vocal cord damage stabilized. She didn't lose her voice. And eventually, carefully, she returned to performing. What is striking about this entire stretch of her story, the late 1990s, the losses, the medical decisions, the grief, is how consistently Ronnie Shacklet appears as the person she came home to. Not as a manager or an industry figure or a professional handler, but simply as her husband, the man she had chosen in 1963 against the advice of everyone around her. It is worth thinking about what the alternative might have looked like if she had listened to her management and waited until after the Copacabana appearance, if she had let the industry calculation win out over what she felt, if she had deferred to the people who thought they knew better about what a pop star's life should look like. The answer, of course, is that she didn't. What 60 years looks like. By the time the 2020s arrived, Brenda Lee had been married to Ronnie Shacklet for more than 60 years. The milestone is significant not just as a number, but as a rarity, a genuine outlier. In an industry where marriages routinely fracture under the pressure of touring schedules, public scrutiny, financial volatility, and the general chaos of a life spent in the spotlight, their marriage had held together through all of it. Through the British invasion, through the blood clots, through the losses, through the career highs and the quiet stretches in between. They had raised 2 daughters. They had watched those daughters grow into adults and become mothers themselves. They had 3 grandchildren, Taylor, Jordan, and Charlie. They had built a life in Nashville, the same city where they had met at a concert on a November night in 1962, and where they had stood together in a church, just the 2 of them on her side of the aisle, and decided to begin. Brenda's retirement came with the same directness she had applied to most decisions in her life. She stepped back, not because she had stopped loving music, but because she looked at what the industry had become and recognized there wasn't a natural place for what she was doing anymore. She had won every award available to her. She had charted hits in multiple decades. When she finally stepped back, she did it with clear-eyed satisfaction rather than trailing reluctance. The one surprise that kept arriving, that kept finding her after she had largely retired, was "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree." The song she had recorded in 1958 at 12 years old, written by Johnny Marks, had never stopped being played. But in 2023, something happened that placed it in a category no one had anticipated. The song was streamed in numbers that made it eligible for modern chart certification, and it reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, more than 60 years after it had been recorded. Brenda Lee, who had been 12 years old when she sang it in a Nashville studio, became one of the oldest artists to ever top the chart in the song's modern streaming era. The achievement was covered widely in the press, and it brought a fresh wave of attention and affection from audiences, many of whom hadn't followed her career but knew the song. She spoke about it with the warmth and lightness of someone who had been around long enough to find unexpected things genuinely funny and genuinely moving at the same time. Ronnie, as always, was not the one standing in front of the camera. He has never been the one in the spotlight. Throughout 6 decades of press coverage of his wife's career, he has remained almost entirely out of frame. By choice, by temperament, by a consistent preference for privacy that has never wavered. What is known about him is drawn largely from a single newspaper article from 1963, a few biographical details, and what can be gathered from the shape of the life he and Brenda built together. He ran his business. He raised his family. He protected his wife from exploitation at moments when she needed protecting. And he stayed through 60 years of a world that gave him every opportunity to be pulled away from the quiet life he had chosen. There's something in that consistency that the music industry, with all of its noise, doesn't always make room for. The people who are most loudly present in a public figure's life are often the ones who take the most. The ones who are there for what the career produces, for what the name opens, for what the talent generates. Ronnie Shacklet was none of those things. He was simply the man who had noticed her at a concert in 1962 and kept showing up every day after that. They still live in Nashville, Tennessee, in the city where it all began, in the city that had watched a teenage girl carry her family out of poverty with nothing but her voice. In the same city where a wedding happened one quiet April morning with the bride's side of the church empty and the whole world none the wiser until the next day's paper. Brenda has talked about the life she chose, talked about stepping away from performing, about what the industry meant to her, about what music meant to her. And the portrait that emerges is of someone who is genuinely at peace, someone who looks back at a life full of early mornings and late nights and hard decisions and says, plainly, that she got it right. She also has a dog. Her husband found it in 2012, 4 weeks old, abandoned in the middle of an interstate highway, malnourished and barely alive, and brought it home. Brenda had only recently lost a beloved pet and was not looking for another one. But she saw the puppy and took it in, nursed it back to health, and kept it. They call her Little Girl. She weighs 86 pounds and has apparently never been given back to anyone. It is, in its own quiet way, a very Brenda Lee story. Someone puts something small and overlooked in front of her, and she decides it deserves a chance. The marriage in full. Looking at the whole of this story, from Atlanta in 1944 to Nashville in the 2020s, the marriage sits at the center of it in a way that is easy to overlook if you're only watching the career. The career is the more visible thing, the chart positions, the television appearances, the tours, the records, the Hall of Fame inductions, the Christmas song that won't die. Those are the things that fill the Wikipedia pages. And they matter. Brenda Lee's contribution to American popular music is real and substantial. Her voice, at its peak, was one of the most recognizable sounds on the radio anywhere in the world. But the life behind all of that was built around the choice she made on April 24th, 1963, at the Radnor Church of Christ in Nashville. In a white two-piece suit, with Ronnie Shacklet's family watching and no one from her own family present. She made that choice at 18 years old, 6 months into knowing the man, against the counsel of her manager, against the wishes of her mother, in defiance of industry convention, and weeks ahead of the schedule that the people managing her career had laid out. There was nothing calculated about it, nothing strategic. It was just the decision of a young woman who had spent her entire childhood being managed and shaped and guided and scheduled, choosing, for once, to do what she wanted. The people who tried to steer her away from it weren't wrong to be concerned. The risks were real. A marriage at 18 to someone she'd known less than 6 months, at the peak of her commercial appeal, in an industry with every historical reason to expect it to fall apart. The skepticism was entirely understandable. But it didn't fall apart. What Ronnie Shacklet turned out to be, not in the immediate blush of 1963, but across the arc of decades, was exactly what the people warning Brenda against him had not calculated for. He became the financial protector who pushed back against exploitation at moments when she needed someone to do that. He became the steady, private presence that absorbed the turbulence of a public life without adding to it. He became the father of her children, the person beside her through surgeries and losses and industry upheavals, the one who found a 4-week-old dog on a highway and brought it home because he knew she would want it. He became, simply, her husband, in the fullest meaning of the word. There is a version of Brenda Lee's story that goes differently, where the management pressure wins out and she waits. And maybe the right timing never quite arrives. Where the industry convention about married pop stars proves correct and the fan base drifts. Where the financial exploitation that Ronnie eventually pushed back on does its damage first. That version of the story doesn't have the same ending. It doesn't have 60 years and 3 grandchildren and a quiet house in Nashville and a big dog named Little Girl. The dramatic part of this story, the part that made headlines in 1963, the elopement and the empty pews and the family who didn't come and the manager who objected, turns out not to be the story of something that went wrong. It turns out to be the story of something that went exactly right, in exactly the way that no one around her could see at the time. Brenda Lee had spent her whole life being told what to do and when to do it. She had sung for presidents and played Vegas and toured Europe as a teenager and carried her family's survival on her voice since she was barely old enough to go to school. She had never really had anything that was entirely her own. When she finally looked up from all of it and made a decision purely for herself, she made a good one. And the decades that followed proved it, quietly and completely, 1 year at a time. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.